Lisa Thompson entered the courtroom with a sense of weariness that clung to her like a heavy coat. The low hum of voices around her filled the air, but she kept her head down and her eyes focused on the floor beneath her feet. She had been through worse in her life, but there was something about this moment that felt different. It wasn't just the ticket or the fine, it was the weight of being here in this space with these people who didn't understand her life or the struggles she faced every day just to survive. There was a quiet tension in the air, a tension that she couldn't ignore as she walked past the rows of benches filled with strangers sitting stiffly waiting for their turn. Just like her shoes echoed on the cold marble floor, and it only seemed to make her feel more exposed as she made her way to the front of the room where the judge sat at his elevated desk, looking down at everyone with a stern expression. He was the kind of man who gave orders without hesitation, someone who didn't need to care about the details of the lives of those who came before him. He had his job, and he did it well. Or so it seemed, at least to the people who never questioned him. Lisa stood at the side of the room, trying to steady her breathing. She didn't want to be here, but she had no choice. The ticket had come, and now she had to face the consequences. Even though she knew it wasn't fair, she had no idea what to expect in this moment. All she could do was stand there and hope that the judge might see her as more than just another face in the crowd. She didn't even look at him, yet she could feel his eyes on her without needing to glance up. She didn't want to give him the satisfaction of seeing her nervous, but she could feel her heart pounding in her chest. It was a strange feeling being in a place like this, being treated as if she were just another case to be processed, another number to be dismissed as irrelevant. She had fought so hard to build a life for herself and her son Jamal. But here in this room, she was nothing more than a black woman trying to justify her existence to a man who probably had no idea what it was like to struggle to get by day after day without the luxury of being seen as anything other than a problem. Lisa finally took a breath and looked up at the judge. The moment their eyes met, she felt a strange jolt of recognition, a brief flicker of something from the past, a memory she couldn't quite place, but something about his face seemed familiar, his features sharp and serious, yet there was something almost human about them, something that made her feel a fleeting sense of connection, like she had seen this man somewhere before. She couldn't figure out why or how, but the sensation lingered as she waited for him to call her name. She didn't know then, but her entire world was about to shift with the sound of one word, one simple name spoken by the man who had no idea how closely their lives had once intersected. Judge Henry Wallace sat behind the grand oak bench, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the room with practiced authority. To him, this was just another ordinary day, another case to process in the never-ending flow of court proceedings. He had seen it all before, or so he thought. Traffic violations, petty theft, small disputes. His days were filled with the monotonous rhythm of the law. He had long ago perfected the art of remaining detached, of viewing each case as a number rather than a story. He wasn't here to understand lives. He was here to enforce the law. His gavel was a symbol of power, and he wielded it like a seasoned soldier. The courtroom filled with a mix of anxiety and impatience, and as his eyes flicked over the crowd, he barely took note of the individuals seated before him. He had heard their pleas before, each one as predictable as the next. Some people tried to charm him with pleading looks, others attempted to offer explanations with trembling voices, but in the end, the law was the law. There were no exceptions. The names were read aloud, and the cases moved quickly. One by one, people stood, spoke their piece, and left the room with either a fine to pay or a judgment against them. The judge's gaze remained fixed on the papers in front of him, reviewing the details of each case with practiced precision. He knew the names on the list, the charges, and the outcomes before the hearings even began. It was a well-oiled machine, and Judge Wallace was its meticulous operator. Then Lisa Thompson's name was called. The air shifted slightly, but Wallace didn't notice. He lifted his eyes, looking at her for the first time. She was middle-aged, a woman of quiet strength and sharp features, her expression guarded as she walked toward the front of the room. She wasn't dressed in the typical flashy manner some people use to make an impression in court. She wore a modest blouse, her hair pulled back neatly. There was nothing about her that screamed for attention, yet there was something about her that caught Wallace's attention. He couldn't quite place it, but a slight unease crept into his thoughts as she stood before him. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice calm and official. "You've been charged with a traffic violation, failure to update your vehicle registration. What do you have to say for yourself?" Lisa looked up at him, and for a moment, their eyes locked. She wasn't intimidated, but there was a quiet challenge in her gaze. Wallace cleared his throat, as if he hadn't expected her to meet his eyes so directly. He quickly turned his attention to the papers in front of him, reading the charge aloud with no emotion. I understand the violation, Your Honor," Lisa said, her voice steady but with a slight edge. "But there are circumstances you may not know about. I'm a single mother. My son, Jamal, is in school, and I work 2 jobs just to keep things together. This fine isn't just about the registration. It's about everything that's stacked against people like me." Wallace looked up from his papers, slightly taken aback. He was accustomed to hearing the typical explanations: financial hardship, lack of understanding, poor circumstances. But something in Lisa's words felt different. He blinked and stared at her for a moment longer than usual. Her voice had a weight to it that he wasn't used to in this sterile environment. "Miss Thompson," Wallace began, his tone still detached, "I'm sure you have your difficulties, but the law is the law. You're aware of the violation, and your registration is overdue." Lisa's gaze didn't waver. "I know the law, Your Honor, but there are moments when it feels like the law is built to break people like me, people who have to fight for everything they have." Her words hung in the air, more than just a plea to avoid a fine. They were a window into the struggle she had faced her entire life, a struggle Wallace had never really understood until now. The room seemed to quiet as her words settled. For a brief second, Wallace felt the shift in the atmosphere, a shift he couldn't explain. There was something in the way she spoke, something in the way she carried herself. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew, deep down, this wasn't just another case. As Judge Wallace sat back in his chair, his mind was strangely unsettled. He had heard countless excuses before, the same lines repeated in every court session, from people trying to justify their mistakes. But Lisa Thompson's words had struck him differently. She wasn't pleading for mercy in the usual sense. She was speaking about something deeper, something personal, something he couldn't ignore. For the first time in a long while, he found himself questioning whether the law, in all its rigidity, was the only answer. Lisa stood there, her eyes calm but unwavering, as if waiting for the judge to respond. Her expression revealed nothing of what was going on inside her, yet there was a quiet resilience about her that intrigued Wallace. He glanced down at the paperwork again, trying to refocus on the facts. Asterisk traffic violation, expired registration, fine due asterisk. It should have been a simple decision, and yet it wasn't. He tried to shake off the growing sense of unease, but something about Lisa's presence was nagging at him. There was a recognition, but he couldn't place it. He'd seen her face before. He was sure of it. The name Thompson wasn't unfamiliar to him either, but that didn't narrow it down much. This was a small town, and many of its citizens had the same last names, a web of connections he had long lost track of. But then, as she spoke again, something clicked in his mind. Asterisk Jamal, asterisk her son Jamal. He had been a classmate of his own son, Nathaniel. The pieces fell into place. He remembered the days when Nathaniel and Jamal would hang out after school. Jamal had always been quiet but sharp, intelligent, kind. A good kid, if not a bit shy. It had always struck Wallace that Jamal and his son, despite being so different in skin color and family backgrounds, had formed a bond that was rare for their small town. They had played basketball together, spent hours studying side by side. Wallace's thoughts drifted back to those afternoons. He'd seen Jamal in his home, though he hadn't really seen him. He had thought little about the dynamics of Jamal's life, the struggles he must have faced being one of the few black kids in their school, or the difficulties he endured at home. But now, standing before him, Lisa was no longer just a face in the crowd. She was the mother of the young man who had once sat at his dinner table, laughing with Nathaniel. Suddenly, the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. Jamal Thompson, the good kid who had been his son's friend, came from this woman. She had worked tirelessly, no doubt, to raise him in a town that probably never fully accepted them. She wasn't just some woman in a courtroom seeking justice. She was a mother, one who had fought for her son's future in a world that had given them few opportunities. For the first time in years, Wallace felt a sense of guilt creep into his thoughts. He had never questioned the privileges he took for granted. He had never questioned what it must have been like for Jamal to grow up in a system that didn't favor him, that didn't see him the same way it saw Nathaniel, his son. He had assumed that the world was as fair as it seemed to him, a world where people were simply rewarded for doing the right thing. But now, as Lisa stood before him, her eyes filled with quiet resolve, he began to see the flaws in that thinking. Wallace looked at her again, this time not as a judge delivering a verdict, but as a man who had, in a way, failed to notice the struggles of those around him. He cleared his throat, his voice suddenly more hesitant. "Miss Thompson," he said, and the room seemed to quiet in response to his tone. I didn't realize." His voice trailed off, and for a moment, he didn't know what else to say. He couldn't ignore the weight of the realization that had hit him square in the chest. Lisa's eyes never wavered. She didn't offer him a smile or a look of forgiveness. She simply stood there waiting. She had already said what needed to be said, and now it was his turn to respond. Judge Wallace sat in stunned silence for a moment, his mind racing with thoughts he had never allowed himself to entertain before. The recognition of Jamal's name, of the boy who had once been his son Nathaniel's closest friend, stirred a strange mix of guilt and confusion within him. His fingers trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses and turned his gaze back to Lisa Thompson, now standing in front of him as a mother, a woman who had fought against odds he had never truly understood. His mind began to drift back in time, to the years when his son Nathaniel and Jamal Thompson had been inseparable. He had fond memories of their laughter echoing through his home, their discussions about basketball, school projects, and what they hoped to do in the future. At the time, Wallace had thought little of the differences between the boys. Jamal, a quiet young man with an easy smile, and Nathaniel, more outgoing, often the center of attention in their circle. He had considered their friendship something normal, something to be celebrated, yet he now realized how little he had truly understood the complexities of Jamal's life. The memories were still vivid. Jamal would come over to the Wallace household, his presence always understated yet somehow calming. He never complained about the challenges he faced. He simply did what was expected, worked hard, kept his head down, and pushed through the difficulties that most others in their school never had to consider. Jamal didn't have the luxury of simply being a kid. He had to navigate a world that was often indifferent to him, one that saw him as different because of the color of his skin. Wallace had never asked about those struggles. He hadn't known how. Suddenly, the warmth of those memories turned sour. He thought about the quiet moments, the unspoken assumptions he had made about Jamal's life. He had never considered what it might have been like for a boy who didn't look like the rest of his classmates. He had never questioned why Jamal had been so reserved, so careful with his words, so cautious in his movements. And now, seeing his mother stand before him, Wallace realized how little he had ever seen or understood about Jamal's reality. His own son, Nathaniel, had always been shielded from the harsher truths of the world. He had been given opportunities without even realizing it. His future was paved with privileges that Jamal could never have taken for granted. Nathaniel could make mistakes, stumble, and still find a safety net beneath him. But Jamal? His world had always been different. There were no safety nets for people like him, no second chances when the system was stacked against them from the start. Judge Wallace's thoughts turned to Lisa Thompson again. The quiet strength she exuded wasn't something he had noticed before, but it was undeniable now. She had raised Jamal in a world that had never made things easy for them. She had done it without the resources, the support, or the privileges that others took for granted. And she had done it alone, facing every challenge with the grace and resilience that only a mother could possess. As Wallace watched her, the realization settled heavily on his shoulders. She wasn't just a woman standing in front of him defending her case. She was a mother who had fought battles he had never seen, carrying burdens he had never imagined. And as much as he had prided himself on his sense of fairness, He knew now that he had been blind to the truths that lay just outside his view. The law had always been black and white to him, clear, clean, and uncomplicated. But now it felt muddy, filled with complexities he hadn't known existed. His breath caught as a deep sense of regret washed over him. How many other people had he judged without truly seeing them? How many others had been reduced to their cases in his court, while their humanity remained invisible to him? He felt a deep sense of shame, not just for the fine he was about to impose, but for the years of misunderstanding. Looking at Lisa again, he finally spoke, his voice lower now, a touch softer. "Miss Thompson, I've made assumptions I shouldn't have." Judge Wallace's words hung in the air, heavy with an unfamiliar vulnerability. Lisa Thompson stood before him, unyielding, her eyes still locked on his, as though waiting for him to make a decision. Wallace was used to making decisions without hesitation, to delivering judgments swiftly and without emotion. But now, facing this woman, he felt the weight of his own ignorance. He hadn't just overlooked the challenges she faced. He had dismissed them entirely. "I've made assumptions I shouldn't have," he repeated, his voice tinged with a quiet sincerity that felt foreign in this courtroom. The words seemed to echo in the space, filling the room with a rare moment of genuine self-reflection. Wallace shifted in his seat, looking down at his papers, but they no longer seemed important. The case defined the law. It all seemed so insignificant compared to the realization that had just crashed into him. Lisa's expression remained unchanged, but her eyes narrowed slightly, as if weighing his words. She had heard all kinds of apologies in her life, and many of them were empty. People who had wronged her or her community often apologized as a way to avoid further confrontation, but their words never truly acknowledged the depth of the hurt they had caused. She didn't expect much from this judge. He was, after all, just another person in a position of power who had never truly seen her, or anyone like her, for who they were. But there was something in his eyes now, something that made her pause. It was subtle, but it was there. She wasn't sure if his change of heart was genuine or just a fleeting moment of discomfort, but she had no time to waste on false gestures. She needed to protect her son and her family, and if that meant standing before this man who had the power to make or break her day, then she would do it with the same resolve that had carried her through every struggle in her life. "I'm not here for your pity, Judge Wallace," Lisa said, her voice steady but firm. "I'm not asking you to feel sorry for me. I'm asking you to see the reality of my life and the lives of so many others who walk into this courtroom and leave with nothing but a fine and the same tired system that doesn't care about them. You don't know me, and you don't know what it's like to wake up every day and try to make ends meet when everything is stacked against you." Wallace listened intently, her words cutting through his thoughts like a sharp knife. He had heard stories of hardship, of struggle, but never from this perspective. Not like this. He had never heard the rawness in someone's voice when they spoke about the daily fight to simply exist. Lisa was speaking not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced by a system that never asked for their side of the story. "I'm not the one you need to apologize to," she continued, her voice rising slightly. "It's my son you need to understand. Jamal has had to fight every step of the way, and I've watched him do it alone. The world doesn't give him the same chances as others, and you have no idea how many times he's been overlooked, ignored, or judged for things that weren't his fault. That's what I'm asking you to see." Her words stung, but Wallace couldn't argue with them. His own son, Nathaniel, had never had to fight for the same opportunities. He had been given a path, paved with privilege, that Jamal had never been offered. The shame of that realization settled deep within him. How could he as a judge have been so blind to the unequal system he helped enforce? How could he have missed the humanity of those who stood before him, trapped in cycles they didn't create? "I'm sorry," Wallace said, his voice barely above a whisper. It was all he could manage. "I truly am." Lisa stood silently, waiting. She didn't need his apology, not really. She needed action. She needed change. She needed this moment to be more than just another empty exchange. But as she looked at him, something shifted. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, genuine remorse, perhaps, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was starting to understand. "I'll make sure your fine is waived," Wallace said, finally finding his voice. "And I'll personally look into how we can better address situations like this in the future. People shouldn't be treated like numbers, Miss Thompson. You and your son deserve more than that." Lisa didn't say anything at first. She just nodded once, sharply. Then, with a final glance at the judge, she turned and walked out of the courtroom, her head held high. She didn't need the judge's pity. What she needed was for her son's future to be brighter than the past she had fought through, and that fight, she knew, was far from over. As Lisa stepped out of the courtroom, a weight lifted off her shoulders, but it wasn't the weight she expected. She wasn't walking away with a sense of victory. No, that would come much later, if at all. But as the doors closed behind her, a feeling she hadn't felt in years settled in: hope. It wasn't something she allowed herself to hold on to for long, but today had been different. The judge had heard her, seen her for a moment at least, and that was something she couldn't easily dismiss. Outside, the cool breeze hit her face, bringing with it a welcome distraction from the chaos of the courtroom. The sun was setting low, casting a golden hue over the city as it began to wind down. It was a familiar scene. The city's heartbeat never stopped, even when the people who lived in it did. Lisa had spent most of her life working against the current, and while she had seen small victories in her fight for survival, there was still so much to be done. As she made her way to her car, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it, already knowing who it was: Jamal. "Hey, Ma. How'd it go?" His voice came through the line with a mixture of concern and hope. Jamal had always been protective of her, even when he was just a kid. Now, as a young man, he carried that responsibility with pride, though it often weighed heavily on his shoulders. "I'm on my way home, baby." "Everything's good," Lisa replied, forcing a smile as she opened the car door. She could hear the relief in Jamal's voice even over the phone, and it made her heart swell with pride. He had been so worried about her, about the fine, about what it meant for their already precarious situation. Lisa hated worrying him, hated that he felt the weight of her struggles, but she knew he couldn't help it. They were a team, whether she liked it or not. "That's a relief. I was worried you were going to end up with another fine or something. You know how these things are." Lisa laughed softly, the sound carrying a lightness she hadn't felt in days. No fines today. But I'll tell you something, Jamal. I had a moment in there. The judge. He actually listened to me." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. He listened. "Are you serious?" "Yeah," Lisa said, taking a deep breath. "He did. And I'm not saying it's a miracle, but he actually apologized for not understanding. It felt different this time, like for once, someone saw. Jamal was quiet for a moment, and Lisa could hear him shifting in his seat, probably pacing around his apartment. "I can't believe that. You think he's going to do something about it? I mean, is it really going to make a difference?" Lisa didn't know if it would. She didn't know if the judge's words would hold any weight in the grand scheme of things, but for the first time, she allowed herself to believe they might. I don't know what'll happen. But what I do know is that things can't keep going the way they have. People like us need more than just the law. We need the people in power to actually see us. Not just as cases, not just as numbers, but as real people with real struggles. There was a long silence, and then Jamal's voice came through, filled with a quiet, thoughtful strength. "You've been telling me that for years, Ma. Maybe he's finally listening. Maybe things are changing. For both of us." Lisa's eyes softened as she looked out the windshield, the evening sky now a deep shade of purple. "Maybe, baby. Maybe." She started the engine and drove through the streets, her mind racing with a mix of doubt and cautious optimism. She had fought so long for a better life for her son, and though she had often felt invisible, today had shown her something important. Change could be slow, but it was possible. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Lisa felt like she was no longer fighting alone. Change wasn't just something that happened, it was something they had to demand. And Lisa Thompson, against all odds, was determined to make sure Jamal, and everyone like him, was seen. The battle was far from over, but today had given her something to hold on to, a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. The next few days passed in a blur for Lisa. Her life, while filled with the same daily grind, picking up groceries, balancing bills, making sure Jamal was staying focused, had taken on a quiet intensity. Something had shifted in her, a new resolve that had started to take root after the courtroom encounter. She couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was, but it felt like the universe had handed her a small, fragile piece of hope, and for once, she wasn't letting it slip through her fingers. But Lisa wasn't naive. She knew better than to expect the system to change overnight. A judge's apology wouldn't fix the broken parts of society, wouldn't erase the subtle prejudices, or end the unfairness her family had experienced for generations. Change was a slow, painful process, and though she could feel the tiniest ripple of it, she knew it was just the beginning. It was a Thursday morning when she received the letter. She had been expecting a follow-up, maybe a formal acknowledgement of the judge's decision, or perhaps some paperwork confirming that the fine had been waived. What she hadn't expected was the official letter from the court, detailing an initiative that had grown directly out of her appearance before Judge Wallace. The letter was brief but clear, and it carried weight that she hadn't anticipated. The court was launching a new community outreach program aimed at better understanding the challenges people from marginalized communities faced when navigating the legal system. The program will include local support services, educational workshops on legal rights, and resources specifically geared toward helping people like Lisa and Jamal, those who had historically been overlooked, those who had always struggled to be seen as equals in the eyes of the law. Judge Wallace, the letter explained, had volunteered to head the program. Lisa stared at the letter for a long time, not quite sure how to process it. The cynic in her wanted to dismiss it, to assume it was just another token effort, a way to pacify people like her without actually doing anything meaningful. But a part of her, the part that had started to believe in change, wanted to give it a chance. Jamal came home that evening to find her still sitting at the kitchen table, the letter in front of her. His eyes immediately locked onto it. "What's that, Mom?" It's from the court," Lisa said, her voice trailing off as she reread the words. "They've started a new program. Judge Wallace is heading it. He wants to help." Jamal's brows furrowed in disbelief. "Wait, that asterisk judge. The one who fined you? The one who—" "Yeah," Lisa interrupted, a slight smile tugging at her lips. "He's the one." Jamal stared at the letter as if it were a foreign object, something that couldn't possibly be real. "I can't believe it. After all these years, after how hard it's been, after everything we've gone through, this might actually be real." Lisa exhaled slowly, still trying to come to terms with the news herself. "I don't know, baby. I don't know. But if there's a chance that things might change, that we might finally be able to have a seat at the table, we have to give it a shot." Jamal shook his head, still processing the information. "I don't know what to think, Mom. It feels too good to be true. How could one man make that big of a difference?" Lisa reached across the table and placed her hand on his. "Sometimes, Jamal, it's the small things that make a difference. One person can start a ripple, and then another, and another. That's how real change happens. It's not overnight, and it's not easy, but it starts somewhere." Jamal looked up at her, his eyes reflecting a mix of skepticism and hope. "So what do we do now?" Lisa's gaze drifted to the window, where the sun was beginning to set, casting a soft orange glow over the neighborhood. She had been fighting alone for so long, but now she wasn't so sure that was the only way. "We take it one step at a time. We show up. We make our voices heard. And we do everything we can to make sure this isn't just some empty gesture. We demand that change." For the first time in a long while, Jamal gave her a small, but genuine smile. It wasn't the smile of a boy who had given up on the world. It was the smile of a young man who had begun to believe that the future might hold something better. The ripple had begun. As the night settled around them, Lisa felt a surge of energy she hadn't felt in years. She wasn't just a mother fighting for her son anymore. She was part of something bigger, something that could change the way their world worked. And that small, fragile piece of hope she had been holding on to, it was no longer so fragile. It was growing. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Lisa and Jamal both took part in the court's new outreach program. The first few sessions were focused on education, on how to navigate the legal system, understanding one's rights, and learning to speak up without fear of being dismissed. Lisa found herself unexpectedly engaged, not just in the material but in the people around her. She wasn't alone anymore. There were other mothers, other fathers, other families who had struggled with the same injustices, the same silencing. For the first time in a long while, she saw hope in their eyes too. It was like a dam had broken open, allowing them all to express the weight they had carried for years. Judge Wallace, true to his word, was present at every session, quietly observing, occasionally offering words of advice, but mostly listening. Lisa still wasn't sure if he understood the full depth of the challenges they faced, but he was there. And that, in itself, was something. Over time, the more he spoke, the more Lisa saw in him a willingness to change, to challenge the old ways of thinking that had kept people like her and Jamal on the margins for so long. But it wasn't just about the programs or the outreach anymore. The real change, Lisa could feel it in her bones, was happening in the way people were starting to view each other. They were no longer just defendants, victims, or suspects. They were people with stories, with lives that mattered. Judge Wallace, though still a figure of authority, began to incorporate a more compassionate, human element into his rulings. There was a shift in the courtroom, subtle yet significant, a recognition that justice wasn't just about following the letter of the law. It was about ensuring fairness and empathy for those who stood before him. One afternoon, Lisa received a call that she hadn't expected. It was from the judge's office. "Ms. Thompson, we would like to invite you to speak at the upcoming community forum. We believe your experience, your story, could help others understand what it's like to face a system that hasn't always been kind." Lisa's breath caught in her chest. The thought of standing in front of a crowd, sharing her story, was intimidating. She wasn't a public speaker, and she had never imagined herself as someone whose voice could carry weight in such a setting. But there was something in her that knew this moment was important, not just for her, but for Jamal, for every single person who had been overlooked and dismissed by a system that hadn't cared enough to understand. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady despite the nervousness bubbling inside her. "I'll speak." That evening, as she shared the news with Jamal, he could hardly believe it. "Mom, you're going to speak? In front of all those people?" Lisa smiled softly, the idea still a bit surreal. "Yes, it's time for us to be heard, Jamal. It's time for our story to matter." The day of the forum arrived, and Lisa found herself standing at the front of a room filled with faces that looked just like hers, faces that had known struggle, had known what it was like to fight for every inch of progress. As she took the microphone, she felt a nervousness she hadn't anticipated, but as she looked out at the audience, something changed. She didn't see just faces anymore. She saw lives. She saw her own journey reflected in theirs. "I'm here today," Lisa began, her voice clear, "because I want to make sure my son doesn't have to fight the same fight I did. I want him, and all of you, to know that change is possible. It's not easy. It's not quick. But it's happening, and we're the ones who are making it happen." She spoke of the challenges she had faced, the countless times she had been dismissed, judged, or silenced. She spoke of Jamal, of his strength and resilience, and of the work they had both done to make sure his future wasn't defined by the limits society had placed on him. By the time she finished, the room was silent for a moment, before a slow, steady applause filled the space. Lisa felt the weight of the moment settle in her chest, not as a burden, but as a triumph. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for every single person who had ever felt invisible, every person who had been underestimated, and every person who had been denied the opportunity to have their voice heard. When she left the stage, Judge Wallace was waiting for her. "You did well," he said quietly, his voice full of admiration. "You made them see you." Lisa smiled, but it wasn't just a smile of accomplishment. It was a smile of determination. She had made them see her, but more importantly, she had made them see her son, and that was only the beginning. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Lisa felt that they were walking towards something brighter. Change had started with one conversation, one apology, and one woman's refusal to be silenced. It was unfolding before her eyes, and she was ready to help shape it.